is Adam Noyce of IraqIran Productions, so welcome to the very first episode of Concerning the Godzilla Saga. Judging by the title, you probably know what this is about. I've already done many videos on them, some of which I've taken down because either they have changed or I've changed things and taken things out, added to, basically embellished on. And I've done, a massive Q&A on the subject, which went extremely well. But I'm basically making this as an attempt to see if I can get some more people interested in the Godzilla Saga, because I don't want to blow my own trumpet. I don't want to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet. Please don't take it that way. However, I'm proud of this. I want people to read it, and I'm very happy to say that, the Godzilla Saga is definitely my biggest of the Facebook pages that I have, that IraqIran Productions hosts. It's definitely the biggest, and it always gets the most likes. I get 3 or 4 likes on that thing a day. People liking the page a day. Which, for a nobody like me, that means a lot. And those people seem to genuinely care about the Godzilla Saga itself as a story. And this is to kind of embellish upon that, give some backstory. And that's exactly what Concerning the Godzilla Saga will be about. It's the lore of the Godzilla Saga that I have literally been creating ever since I was in 5th grade, molding and shaping and basically making what it is today. And we're going to be talking about that here. I'll be trying to do as many of these videos as possible. They'll be going into the characters, key elements within the lore itself that are reasons why certain things happen. These will be explained in the Godzilla Saga, Concerning the Godzilla Saga. Now, to be clear, I will also be answering questions as long as they're not spoiler, as long as they don't contain too many spoilers or anything like that. I will answer questions in the comments. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if they are big enough, if these questions are big enough where I have a big enough answer, I will most certainly be making some sort of video addressing it, hopefully. That's what I plan on doing, and Lord knows when I plan on doing things, they kind of fall through. But this is at least what I want to do. This is just to kind of see if this can reach some other people, because let's face it, the last few reviews that I've done, Kwaidan, Bala Britain, and I'm pretty sure by now the Eagle Has Landed review has come out. If not, that's my next review, The Eagle Has Landed. They haven't been very successful. I've only gotten a little over 100 views on them. Well, if you look at my Godzilla vlogs, there were over 600 views, which again is nothing, but to me that's everything. But things where I talk about Godzilla are definitely the most popular things that I do online. And that's where 90% of my followers come from, and that is the Godzilla fan community. So hopefully this will attract you more to the Godzilla Saga if you're not attracted to that already. So today I'm going to be talking about something very important, and this is the single most important event, most important thing to happen in this universe other than the original 1954 attack itself, because the Godzilla Saga is indeed a sequel. It's not an original story. It is a sequel, direct sequel to the original 1954 masterpiece. The single most important event that happened in this timeline is something called the Second Iraq-Iran War, which happened not long after 9/11 all the way to 2015. This event, the Second Iraq-Iran War, basically it affects a lot of the characters that come up in Godzilla King Kong, which then they affect the characters that come after them. It affects the plot, and it gives the origins to a lot of these characters, and it explains why these characters make the decisions that they do. So this event is very, very important, and I'm going to explain it in full, in detail here. And this goes especially in the first novel of the Godzilla Saga, Godzilla and King Kong, The Battle for Earth, which takes place in 2029, and the next novel takes place in 2045, or somewhere around that time period. So, in case you can't tell, this is an alternate history timeline. Alternate history is basically what happens if something else happened instead of what actually did. It's something very fascinating. If you want to know, one of my favorite channels on YouTube is actually called the Alternate History Hub, because I'm a history buff. And that's like, what if instead of this happened, and how would our timeline be different as a result? And I've always been fascinated by that. So this is an alternate history timeline. However, this isn't a radical alternate history timeline. It is still very recognizable to our actual timeline itself. If you actually want to go into... I made a video on my dead channel, Chopper Pilot 5, called the Godzilla Saga History Timeline. It explains, essentially, what happened, what differed from our timeline to the Godzilla Saga's timeline. And it's basically a bullet point checklist of everything that's different. I do recommend that because that is going to go into more specifics than what this video is about. This video is mainly about one specific incident, and that is the second Iraq-Iran War. However, what is mainly different in this timeline is weaponry has advanced significantly because of key things that we'll kind of touch upon in this video. The United States Armed Forces in general has changed quite a bit. It's much bigger, much more powerful, and basically just global politics in general. I love writing stories about global politics. You know, it's weird. Some people have read my short stories that I've had published on websites and published in newspapers. You know, talking about, or writing stories, romance stories, very character-driven stories, and if you watch any of my movies, some people would say they are very character-driven as a whole. But yet some people say I write them too dry. I write these character pieces too dry. Well, the Godzilla Saga isn't really a character piece. It has characters in it that definitely go through some kind of an arc, for sure. But this is these are very plot-heavy stories, where you have point A, point B, and everything in between is getting to point B. And those are actually my favorite kind of stories, kind of like docudramas. In fact, that's how I want to approach the Godzilla sagas, these docudramas kind of things. And I love history. I love politics and everything, so I'm incorporating them all here. In fact, one of those key elements is actually the #1 theme of the Godzilla Saga, which will most likely be a different video. I will discuss the biggest theme in the Godzilla Saga in a different video. What actually changes this timeline? What truly does, because I'm actually a firm believer in something known as the butterfly effect, which is if you change one tiny thing in the past, it will butterfly and mushroom into something, into a world just unrecognizable. I'm sure I don't believe it as chaotic as that, or as extreme as that, but I do believe, in an extent, the butterfly effect. And that's definitely here, because in this case, the butterfly is the 1954 Godzilla attack on Tokyo, Japan. That's where everything started changing. That is where our timeline and this timeline begins. So, as a result of the 1954 attack, Nixon becomes the President of the United States in 1960. And this was due to a surge in national pride over who was to blame for the actual Godzilla attack. The Soviets were blaming the United States, and the United States were blaming the Soviets because it was their nukes that built or mutated Godzilla to then attack Tokyo. And of course, Japan is caught in the middle, just like they always are, and just like they always were in the Cold War. And that will actually become important later. Nixon basically rode on this tragedy. He did a very political thing, and made it into an issue. And it actually bolstered enough of his support and voters that he actually managed to top JFK. Because that election, if you research it, was actually one of the closest elections in American history, if not the single closest election in American history. And this 1954 attack bolstered enough national pride for Nixon that he barely wins. He squeezes a victory out against John F. Kennedy. Now this becomes very different. The alternate timeline begins to truly differ from our timeline with the election of Nixon, and specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis. What would have happened if this happened after doing a lot of research is Nixon actually uses a small nuclear bomb on Cuba to wipe out the missile base. So it actually, if you look at it, the Cold War actually becomes hot at this moment. There is actual gunfire, there is, fighting going on. And of course, the Cubans are devastated and the Soviets don't know what to do. That's because Nixon, if elected president at that time, would have used something known as madman theory, which was something that him and his staff were concocting. And Madman Theory was basically a bluff story. And that is basically bluff the Soviets, even though they had no intention of doing this, bluff the Soviets into thinking that you're crazy enough that they will launch all your nuclear missiles at them to get the Soviets to stop. That was Madman Theory in a nutshell. Hopefully I can explain that to you well enough. And what happens because of this Madman Theory put into full effect here, where he actually fires a nuclear bomb on Cuba, fires a nuclear missile on Cuba, wipes out that missile base, and then he also threatens to launch missiles towards Moscow and everything like that, and the Russians are also on red alert. What happens is Premier Khrushchev, who was in charge of Russia at the time, believes in this bluff. He falls for this bluff, he falls for Nixon's bluff, and as a result, a ceasefire is commenced, and all goes kind of back to normal. Cuba, instead of remaining a communist country, kind of remains in American control. Castro is still in power, don't get me wrong, but he's very weakened by this nuke, because now our thumb is literally right over them. And so they become more of an antagonistic ally, if that makes any sense. Where they won't fight us, but yet now we still have open trade with them because of this situation, because the Russians absolutely leave, and their influence is limited because of Nixon's Madman Theory. So on and so forth. I could go on and on and on about this for ages, but that's not what we're here to talk about. However, this event, Khrushchev falling for Nixon's bluff, damages the Soviets' pride badly, because they just lost in an actual battle. They just lost. And so this actually leads to an even more intense rivalry between the Soviets and the United States, where they're literally at each other's throats. Instead of trying to beat each other economically, tons more troops are put in Germany. You know, the border between West and East Germany, there are thousands of more troops stationed there. There are troops stationed all in Alaska and by, you know, that area of Russia. We are just, it's a powder keg ready to go off at any moment. The Cuban Missile Crisis in our timeline was the closest thing to the Cold War actually truly becoming hot. And I know some people will say, like, the Vietnam War was the Cold War and the Korean War was the... You're absolutely right. But, I mean, in terms of us actually fighting the Soviets, Russians versus Americans, in this timeline, that Cuban Missile Crisis got hot. Therefore, the powder keg would be lit. And we are literally ready to go to war. It's basically kind of like our situation with Russia was kind of like the situation between North Korea and South Korea, where it's no one enters, no one gets out, no one crosses that border, especially if you want to live. There are armed guards everywhere, and if you cross that border, you will be shot. That kind of intensity between East and West is very prevalent now. And this actually starts really accumulating in the Middle East, because the Russians were arming the Iranians, and the United States was backing Kuwait, Afghanistan, and Iraq because they had all the oil, and Iran wanted to, you know, conquer the Middle East and make their own Muslim empire, which, despite what people say, Saddam Hussein was actually based, his political party was actually based kind of off the Nazi thing. It wasn't actually like a Muslim rule thing. In fact, Saddam Hussein actually hated Islam. He hated that. He was a horrible man, don't get me wrong, but he actually hated Islam and thought it would actually hurt his empire itself. You know, he also wanted to conquer. We're getting way ahead of ourselves here. As a result, you know, just keep that sort of Middle East tension in the back of your mind. As a result, the United States and the Russians increased their military might by like 100%. Military spending on both sides literally is, I describe it as being over triple what it actually is in our timeline. It mushrooms, it explodes, military spending, because of all this tension. It's almost as bad, not quite as bad, but almost as bad as what happens in the Fallout universe. It is that tense, that chaotic. And they keep growing from the missile crisis. And this type of military spending, the amount we spend, taxpayers' money, is brought into the military, increases significantly all the way up into the 90s, when the Soviet Union falls. Even after that, the United States continues to build their military might. Another thing that is very different in this timeline is because Nixon was elected, we would not have entered the Vietnam War. Nixon made that very, very clear, that we would not enter the Vietnam War. We'd be pretty isolationist, if you really look at it. So the North Vietnamese take South Vietnam from France, basically, and then they make one united Vietnam. Now, if you know the history behind Vietnam, you will know that that is why, you know, the draft is no longer why it is like it is today. You know, we still have to, all men still have to sign up and everything like that, but we aren't automatically drafted, if that makes any sense at all. So because Vietnam never happened, that never occurred. You know, those changes in policy never occurred, which becomes very important with the second Iraq-Iran War. Not only that, but the anti-American sentiment, anti-government sentiment, the hippie movements, the everything like that never really mushroomed like they do. We still have the civil rights movement hands down. We still have all this crap. That still goes relatively the same. Though it becomes much more of a forefront in this universe and everything kind of progresses quicker because there wasn't a war going on. If there wasn't a war going on, you know, people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and stuff would have mushroomed further and would have been more on the spotlight because we weren't really at war. There was tension, but we weren't really at war. So that's exactly what happens. And so that draft thing, keep that in the back of your mind because that becomes a very key element in the second Iraq-Iran War. But what happens through the 70s, 80s, and 90s is oil tycoons arise in the United States. Oil is very, very important, always will be important, to basically fuel our military, to keep our military's blood pumping. Oil tycoons rise, specifically in the west and southwest of the United States. And they start buying oil wells in Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. They begin buying all these oil refineries there, and they have armed guards guarding it, and they have all this crap. They're becoming billionaires. It's basically like the tycoons of the early 1900s. You know, Rockefeller. You know, those kind of people. These kind of people arise, but with oil, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And one of these families specifically is the Hagens family. The Hagens family, though not the most richest and not the largest or the most important of these tycoons, they are very important because one of the main characters in the Godzilla Saga, in Godzilla and King Kong, is Colonel Benjamin Hagens. But we'll get into him a little later in a different video. But so they buy a lot of oil in the Middle East, and American companies run them and own them. You know, OSHA doesn't really happen. OSHA is a thing, don't get me wrong, but it kind of collapses as more and more of these oil refineries are being bought out and paid for by just specifically the United States, and then the United States receives the oil, and then the United States exports the oils to countries like England, France, Germany, and so on and so forth. So America basically has a tight grip on the oil industry as a result. And this, again, mainly has to do with military spending. How are we going to fuel all these tanks, all these vehicles, all these aircraft carriers, everything? Well, oil people arise. And it's not just in the Middle East, but we also have oil in the United States that's being drilled left and right, which actually becomes kind of important later on in the Godzilla Saga. The Gulf War still occurs. The Gulf War still occurs. Most of the same events actually happen. The Gulf War is very similar in this timeline as in the Godzilla Saga timeline. Hussein is still kept in power for some strange reason, and it's a quick victory for the United States. Hoorah! And American pride as a result, because we haven't really been in a war since Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was a great victory for the United States. Pride, American pride, nationalism is at an all-time high. If you thought American pride was crazy after 9/11, yeah, it's tenfold here. Because we're bolstering on the fact that we have not lost a single war. Well, what happens is the Soviet Union falls in the 1990s. Chernobyl still happens, so on and so forth. The Soviet Union falls. And again, I'm explaining all this because it leads up very importantly to why the second Iraq-Iran War happens. The Soviet Union falls, and their armed forces are cut by 2/3 for the Russians to accommodate for their massive debt that had basically been created. And by the way, the debt for the United States is also way worse than it is in our timeline because of all this military spending. Way worse. Way worse. And also some of these social welfare programs don't exist in this timeline because, again, a lot of them were created because of the Vietnam War and after the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War never happened, so a lot of these social welfare programs and social benefit programs never exist in this timeline. But despite the fact that the Soviets fall, they're cutting spending on their military, and now they are Russia. They are not the Soviets anymore, they are Russia. The communism has ended. America is still spending a lot of money on their military, and their military is still growing. They are by far the largest military in the world. In fact, 1 in 3 people in the United States are in the army, work for the army somehow, be it they're paper pushers, cooks, anything. They deal with the army, or not the army, but just the American Armed Forces. 1 in 3 people. That's nuts. That's insane. So war breaks out between Iran, likely funded by Russia, and Iraq. Again. And basically, as a defense mechanism to preserve the oil refineries that the Americans owned, the United States government orders troops to be sent to Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and all that, to basically guard those facilities, guard those oil refineries, because they are very important. They equal 2/3 of the world's oil supply. There's that much oil being pumped out of them. And again, all going into American hands. Of course, they want those oil refineries protected. So the United States sends more troops over there to protect them. But things quickly begin to go sour. 9/11 happens, and it's still extremely devastating, and that genuinely hurts our pride. That genuinely hurts us because we thought we were safe. Even with this large military, we thought we were safe. It turns out we're not. It still happens, and many, many people, unfortunately, still die in this timeline. So then we go out into all-out war in the Middle East. We're sending thousands upon thousands of troops over there, thousands of land forces, and everything like that. And this, of course, angers the indigenous populations of Iraq, Afghanistan, basically the entire Middle East other than Israel. Now, because we'd never fought in a war like this before, we were fighting it conventionally. Just like in Vietnam, that leads to a lot of problems. This becomes a political war, where the politics have to say, not the generals. This becomes a political war. We are still fighting a conventional war against an enemy who does not fight conventionally, because we never had that experience in Vietnam. It happens here in the second IraqIran War. Because this angers the indigenous population, basically Iraq and Iran create a ceasefire with themselves and unite with pretty much every country, either at gunpoint or actually unification because of what they believe in, unite against America. And America is going in on this battle alone. We are absolutely in this war alone because of the oil, essentially. There are some British and some French forces there, but it's mainly America. Now, it's funny because I said that basically the entire Middle East unites against the United States. What happens is after the war, that sort of unification immediately dissolves into chaos, and the Middle East is now nothing but basically one crater because of it, because of all these civil wars that break out. So no, it wouldn't be any peaceful. It wouldn't be any more peaceful. The Muslims are still beheading themselves left and right. But as you guessed, this is this universe's Vietnam War. The second Iraq-Iran War becomes this universe's Vietnam War. Because we had no idea who the enemy is. Women and children were being slaughtered just as well with the trained soldiers. It was a bloodbath. Entire towns completely wiped off the face of the earth. For example, Baghdad is completely flattened. There's nothing left of Baghdad. Nothing is left. It's completely flattened. Thousands upon thousands of Americans are being killed. Almost a million civilians alone are killed. It's a bloodbath. And at first we thought we could handle it. At first the United States thought they could handle this sort of influx, but they couldn't. So a draft is put into place. Again, remember the draft stuff, as I mentioned earlier, because of Vietnam, never happened. So the draft is still in effect, and people start getting drafted into this war, which at first people were okay with. But as things got worse, and as news coverage started going nuts over the example, and seeing a lot of the atrocities, public opinion started souring just like they did in the Vietnam War. And that's basically the beginning of the end of the Second IraqIran War, or chances of America succeeding at this war, is public opinion. Because of these films being shot. And we'll get into a major example on that. One of the main characters in Godzilla and King Kong made a huge documentary that swayed a lot of those public opinions. But something else very important happens that brings about a horrible end to the Second Iraq-Iran War. And that is, nuclear power begins to really take hold here in the United States. Not just the United States, but the world in general. And that's because a lot of advances in technology. And what was basically happening was these private companies, specifically in the United States, we're talking about the United States here, these private companies were like, you see what's going on in the Middle East? Yeah, that's kind of bad. We need to kind of break ourselves from that. Because again, 2/3 of the world's oil supply is coming from the Middle East. Oil prices are skyrocketing because of this war. There's an oil shortage, not just in the United States, but around the world. Tensions are bad. You know, people are very, very tense. And so they're like, well, how can we step away from that? Nuclear power was still a very viable option. And so a bunch of these private companies started investing in nuclear power advances. And as a result, technology was created that allowed safer reactors to be built and more reactors to be built at the same time. And they were all to be built the same way. So if one goes wrong here, we know exactly what's going to happen to it, and we know exactly how to fix it. If one goes wrong in New Hampshire, we know how to fix it. If one goes wrong in California, we know how to fix it. They're all going to be built the same way and with basically the same technology. And what happens is that cuts intake of oil to the US by 1/3. By 1/3. That is so much oil, guys. That is so much oil. That's unheard of. And so basically, instead of paying an oil bill or a tax bill to heat your home, you're basically paying just a general power bill. So not only that, but you're also saving money yourself because of that. You don't have to pay for oil as much. It's used for heating, it's used for running water, it's used for electricity. Nuclear power nuclear energy in general just basically becomes the main thing. As you can probably tell with Godzilla's return, that becomes a very, very important thing later on. So basically the oil tycoons begin to lose their power as a result. The oil tycoons start losing a lot of money and start losing that influence that they had on the government, started losing their influence on public opinion, television, they start losing their image. Refineries begin to shut down all over the Middle East, not just because they're getting blown up and utterly destroyed, but because they don't have the money anymore to run them because of these nuclear power plants being arrested. Again, remember, the Second Iraq-Iran War takes place from 2000 to 2015. That's 15 years. So violent protests begin to break out across the nation. Oil tycoons and the U.S. Armed Forces are mainly attacked in these protests. And they are much worse than they were in the Vietnam War, because now we have social media, we have 24-hour news coverage, we have all this crap. It's much worse and much more publicized than what it was in the Vietnam War era. And they are violent. There are bloody clashes. National Guards are calling in California. Students are shot, and so on and so forth. It's very, very bloody. And the armed forces are basically blamed. The army faith in the United States military in general is tainted because of this war. And public opinion of the army dips like crazy. Public support actually dwindles to a low 12%. 12%. That's the lowest. Even now, even during the Vietnam War, it was higher than that. It falls to 12%. So what happens is, after the bloody conflict and a lot of campaigns that we'll actually get into when we actually talk about some of the characters, the war comes to an end in 2015, and America finally leaves the Middle East in general. Just utterly leaves. No forces left, no bases left, nothing. We leave the Middle East. The only thing that we have any contact with is Israel, and Israel is still holding the line. Over 100,000 Americans are killed. 100,000 are killed. Soldiers return home and they are mocked and hated by the youth and the newest generation of the United States. Eggs are thrown at them. One character in particular, this really hits home with. No monuments are built to recognize the soldiers' efforts or their bravery. They are mocked and they are hated. They are disrespected beyond belief by basically the youth of America. My generation. And as a result of this war, there was a huge overhaul in the United States government. Huge overhaul. Over 90% of incumbents are voted out. It is that bad. It is that huge. The draft is utterly, utterly eliminated. Everything is just utterly eliminated. Everything created by Abraham Lincoln, gone. There is no draft. There is still a draft today. That's why we have conscription. All males over the age of 18 have to sign up for it. That's gone in this universe because of this war. Public opinion was that bad about it. It's gone. U.S. military spending is literally cut in half. In half. In case you don't know, military spending in this timeline is, well, almost 80% of where our budget comes from. Imagine cutting that in half. Imagine how many people would be laid off and be out of work and everything like that. That's unheard of. And with a military as large as this, it suddenly being cut in half is insane. Insane. Utterly cut in half. And public opinion on the military remains low until 2015, all the way through 2029. After the 2029 attack, public opinion begins to change, and we see another military increase. But until 2029, the military continues to be cut and cut and cut. And actually, by 2029, it is cut again by another 25%. Again by another 25%. So now we're down to a quarter of what was originally there. That is what leads to many of the decisions that happen, be them good or be them bad, in Godzilla and King Kong, the first novel of the Godzilla Saga. People debating on the use of armed forces, the use of weaponry. Do we kill Godzilla? Do we leave him alive? What do we do? The second IraqIran War is the key to that universe. The key. And that's why I'm making this video. So you can listen to it and understand it better. I pray to God that I did a good job trying to represent what happens actually in the book, but hopefully this can actually help you listening to this video. Because let's face it, you listen to these videos, you don't watch them. So, in the end, stay tuned for more episodes of the Godzilla vlogs and reviews and so on and so forth. Go on Facebook, like IraqIran Productions. Like the Godzilla Saga on Facebook for all up-to-date information on the books. Join Geeks for Geeks, which is the group that I've created, me and several others, where we're just a bunch of geeks here there to promote yourself and to talk about what you love and to show off the stuff that you make and you create. We love that stuff, so you're welcome to join us there. And I have a new page called The Individualist Creator, which is basically where I go on philosophical diatribes of how I think the world works, even though I probably have no clue as to how the world works, but I nonetheless like to talk about it. So yes, it's very political. Very, very, very political. So you can like that on there. So in the end, this is Adam Noyce of IraqIran Productions saying, sayonara.